Chapter 1, Part 2, A Name, Eventually. Before we get to the milk, there was still an elephant standing quietly in the corner of the delivery room, the kind polite people wait to mention until the drama has died down. I didn't have a name. I had survived strangulation by my own umbilical cord, a diagnosis of no sign of life, and my own unassisted return from it. I had been loud enough to summon a doctor and then baptized him in the least dignified way available to me. Administratively speaking, I was still nobody. Being pronounced dead and then alive again in the same afternoon is a lot of plot for one person. Doing it without so much as a name tag is just showing off. This wasn't for lack of planning. It was for lack of the right kind of planning. Sonar scans weren't a routine fixture of pregnancy in 1981, and the one they did run on me had been booked to answer a considerably grimmer question than what's it going to be. Even if anyone had thought to ask, the picture on that monitor had roughly the resolution of a weather map faxed twice. And nobody was in any real hurry to fix that. You don't assign names to the dead, and for a good stretch of that pregnancy, on paper, that's exactly what I was. Somewhere in the run-up to my arrival, the household had quietly settled on the assumption that I would be a girl, with the same misplaced confidence people bring to naming a hurricane before it has finished deciding how much of the coastline it intends to take. So there I was, alive against considerable odds, freshly resuscitated, and entirely without a name, because the one they'd prepared belonged to a person who had never been real at any point in the pregnancy. This caused a bit of a fuss in the practical sense. A person needs a name fairly promptly, if only for the paperwork, and the paperwork needed a name fast. Somewhere a clerk was already tapping a pen. The obvious solution was a family name. That is where the trouble started. My brother had it easy. He'd inherited my father's names in full. First, second, and surname, the whole barrel, passed down the way you'd hand off a car that still ran fine, still had all its hubcaps, and hadn't yet been driven into anything embarrassing. That was the custom in the family. Names traveled forward whole rather than getting redesigned every generation, presumably because somebody decided long ago that if a name worked once, it should be made to keep working. Which meant that by the time I came along, my father had already spent his full allotment on his firstborn. There was nothing left in the tank to pass on to me. He'd handed down the entire name and kept none of it in reserve, a bit like giving away your only umbrella and then acting personally betrayed when it starts raining directly on you and nobody else on the street. The names themselves weren't tradition for tradition's sake. They were an actual family heirloom, the kind normally reserved for pocket watches and questionable furniture, except nobody could sell this one at auction or leave it in an attic. They went back a genuinely alarming length of time. First, second, and surname intact, matching one of the first Dutch settlers at the Cape, name for name, as if the family had signed a contract centuries ago and nobody since had thought, or been brave enough, to renegotiate the terms. That forefather of mine dropped anchor in Table Bay on April 6th, 1652, sent out by the Dutch East India Company as part of a fleet of 3 ships to build a refreshment station at the Cape for vessels running the spice trade out to the east and back to the Netherlands. His job on arrival wasn't soldier or merchant or anything that photographs well for a museum plaque. He was sent to be head groundskeeper of the fort, hired to keep the grass tidy while other men fought over spices and empires around him. Nearly 4 centuries later, my branch of the family walked away from all of it holding a rake and a job title nobody ever put on a coin. I mention the groundskeeping because it does not stay background forever. The Netherlands, the family name, and a man who spent his working life with his hands and soil all come back into the picture years later, long after anyone in that library in 1981 could have guessed why. So with the family name budget spent and a nameless newborn on the clock, my father did what any resourceful man in 1981 did when he needed information fast. He went to the library, not in the leisurely, browsing sense, but in the sense of a man working to a deadline set by a clerk with a pen. No internet, no search bar, no scrolling through baby name apps in a waiting room while pretending to listen to your partner. Just a building full of books, a card catalog, and the physical work of walking there, which as Google if Google were made of wood and ran at the top speed of a tire man's legs. He came back with 2 names, not 2 favorites carefully weighed against each other, not two names that spoke to him in some meaningful, destiny-shaped way. He put them both in front of my mother. That one starts with the same letter as my name, he said. That one starts with the same letter as yours. That was the entire methodology. The naming equivalent of picking a lottery number because it was your childhood house number. Somewhere between the shelves, the search for meaning had quietly given way to the search for a good enough starting letter. Deadline met, box ticked, clerk satisfied. You'll have noticed I haven't told you what those two names are. I'm not going to. This one belongs to Mr. Nowhere, and he'd rather not share the billing with a man who was named by alphabet.